Speaking of bad stuff to put in your body, speaking of getting shot, speaking of weird hang-ups about eating, speaking of rainbows, speaking of violence and the collapse of the media's veneer of integrity, speaking of regime propaganda media, speaking of strange headlines, speaking of victory, speaking of other things that I'm obviously right about. Speaking of New Yorkers whining, speaking of unnecessary pain and suffering, speaking of not welcoming everybody into every tent, speaking of women and sex, speaking of weird sex stuff, speaking of bad things that everyone seems to agree upon, speaking of the robots, speaking of embracing, speaking of love and marriage and the baby carriage, speaking of putting hands where you shouldn't. Man, sometimes my segues impress even me.